Well, this is the last in a series of sermons.
Second.
You're right. This is the second. My mind jumped ahead a whole lot. Just read the text. Well, this is the second in a series of sermons on the book of Job. Last week we looked at the character of Satan, which was really interesting to me because you are forcing me to open some reference books that haven't been opened before. It's great fun. Well, when we left off, God had removed all his protections from around Job and given him to Satan. And Satan killed all 10 of his children, and all of his wealth was taken away. One of the great Bible passages is Job's response. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. You recognize the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away? Well, then God and Satan have another conversation where God says, look, he's still faithful and righteous. And Satan says, well, let me attack him personally and let's see what happens. So Satan inflicted him with sores all over his body. We find him sitting in the ashes of a campfire, scraping his sores with broken pottery. I think he had shingles. Oh no, see? That would be as bad as it gets. And then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." Some wife, huh? Do you still persist in your integrity? But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And by the way, that is the last we hear of Mrs. Job. And I am eager to hear, because Karen's sermon on Job will be from the viewpoint of Mrs. Job. Well, now introduced are Job's three friends. They monopolize the story for the next 36 chapters. The next 36 chapters are a series of speeches, often given in poetry, where the three friends all take a run at Job, and Job refuses to accept their argument, and they go round and round and round. Now, when Job's three friends heard all of these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. By the way, do you know who the shortest man in the Bible was? Bildad the Shuhite. He was only as tall as your shoes. See what I learned in seminary? They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Isn't that an interesting picture, where these three friends come and they sit with him in silence? That is the Jewish custom, even to this day. Well, not for a week, but to just go and to sit. One of my frustrations as a preacher at a funeral or memorial service is I realize that nothing I can say can change what's happened. I might put a spin on it, but I can't change the facts. Silence is a good way to respond to this kind of suffering. But then, after a week, Job's friends decide that they want to help. And they are absolutely sure that all this has happened because Job has in some way sinned and deserves this suffering. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, "How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. If you'll seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore to you your rightful place. Though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great." Interesting argument. God must be just. God must be fair. Therefore, God sent the suffering upon Job because he deserved it. Can there be any other answer? And around they go. Job refuses to accept their answer to the question of why. It's interesting to note that the three friends are defending God's honor. God, they say, is just and fair, and we can't think of God in any other way. God must be just and fair. It's interesting because they're arguing from the same viewpoint as Satan. And in fact, for the rest of the book, they are the voice of Satan, the accuser. To prove their point, the three friends use all kinds of scripture and platitudes. Platitudes. I made a list of all the platitudes I've heard over the years. It's all for the best. God just needed another flower in his garden. Give it a couple of weeks and you'll be ready to move on. Everything happens for a reason. All things work for good. When Christians die, they go to heaven, so Christians shouldn't grieve. At least the suffering is over. God helps those who help themselves. This person wasn't a Christian, so we know where he's gone. Remember, God has a plan. What doesn't destroy you makes you stronger. You know what's interesting about all these platitudes, and I really have heard them all and more. What's interesting about these platitudes is that they are all at least partly wrong, if not complete out-and-out lies. They're offered because we don't know what else to say. We see someone suffering. We want to make things better. We don't know what to say, so we offer a platitude. But they're all lies. They're all falsehoods, at least partly. My favorite platitude is, God will never give you more than you can handle. Have you ever stopped to consider the theology in those 10 words? First of all, God is the source of suffering. God is the source of all the pain in the world. Are we sure we want to believe that? And God measures it out so that you don't get too much or too little. Are we sure we want to believe that? And God looks down from heaven and says, well, you know, things have been kind of quiet for Larry lately, so I think he needs some more suffering. Really? And there is the matter of the Bible. You know that those three friends are quoting Deuteronomy. They're quoting the Bible to Job. And they're wrong. Did you know that you can make the Bible say about whatever you'd like it to say? You can use it to hurt or to heal. The Bible was not let down from heaven on a golden cord, all finished and ready to use. The Bible was inspired by God, but it was written by men who wrote out of their own experience of God. That's why it's a dangerous thing to interpret the Bible by ourselves, that it's better interpreted in community, that we can listen to each other's voices. One of the most interesting things about the arguments of the friends of Job is their belief that God is violent. As I've seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. The strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and the whelps of the lionesses are scattered. It's all through Job that God is violent. But what do you believe about that? Is God violent? Well, at first thought, the answer is, well, of course. The Bible's full of God's violence. The Exodus, the fall of Jericho, the destruction of Jerusalem. On and on are the stories of God commanding violence or doing violence by himself. But then there's the second thought. Jesus. You remember him. Jesus, who showed us what God looks like. Jesus said, hey, if you want to know what God's like, look at me. Was Jesus violent? Okay, there was that cleansing of the temple in John, the Gospel of John. But did Jesus establish the kingdom through violence? Did Jesus use violence to overthrow Herod and the Romans? No, he didn't. Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Jesus wouldn't allow his followers to protect him from arrest. He wouldn't allow God to protect him from the cross. Jesus was not violent. And isn't he then reflecting the nature of God, telling us that God is not violent? You know what that means? Well, first of all, it means that every time somebody tries to tell us that some war is the will of God, we may have to say no. It isn't. It may be a necessary evil, but it's not God's will, because God is not violent. And it means that we'll seek to be reconciled with the people who we've broken the relationship. It's an interesting aspect of God to consider. In chapter 32, the book of Job takes an interesting turn with the introduction of Elihu, the fourth friend. We've not heard of him up to that point. It was the three friends who came in chapter 2. Here's the fourth one. The best guess is that Elihu was a later addition to the manuscript. At some point, somebody read through Job and said, this is not finished. It's not good. It's not adequate. It doesn't give us a good enough answer to the question of suffering. So we need another answer. So they introduced Elihu, written at a different time. Nobody likes him, by the way. He is described as pompous, long-winded, a bigot, or just plain ridiculous.
I think I know him.
I think so. But he offers an interesting answer to the problem of suffering. God sends suffering upon us in order to make us stronger people, in order to give us a stronger faith. It's called the doctrine of redemptive suffering, and it is all over the place even now. That idea that, suffering's no fun, but it's really a good thing because it'll make us stronger. From the 33rd chapter, I found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then he prays to God and is accepted by him. He comes into his presence with joy, and God repays him with righteousness. That person sings to others and says, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not paid back to me. He's redeemed my soul from going down to the pit, and my life shall see the light. God indeed does all these things twice, 3 times, with mortals, to bring back their souls from the pit. It's suffering that saves us. It's suffering that makes us worthy people. Suffering is really a good gift from God. Is that not the biggest bunch of baloney you've ever heard?
Thank you.
Well, sure. Good things may happen in the midst of suffering. And there may be lessons to be learned in the midst of suffering. But redemptive suffering is ridiculous. If all the suffering in the world is sent upon us in order to make us better people, then God needs to get better aim. Because the people who most need redemption aren't the ones suffering the most. In my experience, it's the good people who suffer as much as the bad. There is no amount of redemption that's worth all the suffering in the world. That's foolishness. And if that's God, I want off the bus. And so we come to the end of chapter 37. Job is sitting in the ashes of a fire, covered with sores, surrounded by his 3 kind of friends. Job has lost absolutely everything and has no idea why. 3 of his friends are sure that he must have sinned. He must deserve this, that God is just. And that if he would just ask forgiveness, that if he would just admit it, God would let up on him. And then there's the 4th friend who says, boy, all this suffering is really a good thing for you, Job. It'll make you really strong. Job refuses all their arguments. He refuses to accept them as true. And Job continues to shake his fist in the face of God and say, God, I didn't deserve this. I don't deserve this. I deserve an answer. You need to tell me why this happened. Job again took up his discourse and said, "As God lives, who's taken away my right, and the Almighty who's made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God's in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood. He will not admit to a sin he didn't commit. And my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you're right. Until I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast to my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days." So we have dug ourselves a really deep hole. You know that one of the first tenets of Buddhism is that everybody suffers. It's true. Everybody does suffer. And we all ask the question, why? Why has this happened to me? Two of the possible answers are, you deserved it, we deserved it, I deserve it. The other answer is, it's really a gift to make me stronger. Both of those answers have been rejected. We're right back where we started. Next week, God speaks out of the whirlwind. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, we all know suffering. And we all know what it feels like to look at the world and say to you, this is not how it ought to be. We've all felt that the world was unfair, unjust. We've all felt as if you could do a better job. Help us, God, to trust, to listen, be patient. In the name of Christ. Amen. You know,